Hey everyone, back again. Today we're starting Manufacturing Consent, or Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent, and this is going to be a three-parter. So the first part is going to cover the preface in Chapter 1, in which they lay out their propaganda model, specifically the lens through which they're going to be viewing and looking at a number of news stories to reveal the pro-American anti-communist interests that have largely influenced mass media over the past few decades. And they're writing this, they wrote this almost 40 years ago. So there's a lot has changed. A lot has stayed the same though. So that'll be part one, and part two will look at the Latin American context in which Chomsky and Herman look specifically at news stories regarding Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and how the New York Times and other mass media news outlets just reflected American interests by denying a lot of what else was going on in a lot of other parts of the world, and how American interest was essentially being satisfied there. We'll also look at a case of Romania and a few other places. And then the third part is going to look specifically at the cases of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and the important role that the media serve there in manufacturing consent for the U.S.'s invasion of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, their support for El Timor, like all of these places, the horrors that the United States orchestrated in these parts of the world. We're going to look at all of that, but that'll be in part 3. I really want to put this right up front, is that we're going to be talking about a lot of really difficult stuff here, not in great detail. We're going to be talking about war atrocities, American violence. We're going to be talking about sexual assault in the rape and murder of a number of nuns in Latin America, and again, not in great detail. But we're going to talk about these things because these were the topics of much media commentary, or lack thereof. So we're going to be looking at all these things, these very difficult topics over the next few episodes, so just be prepared for that. But again, not in great detail. But before jumping into it, if you don't know who I am, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and texts and ideas and all that stuff. So if you're new here, you can find this as a podcast if you found it on YouTube. If you found this as a podcast, you can find it on YouTube as well, where sometimes I accompany what I say with video, if you're into that. You can follow me on other platforms. You can help me out by liking, sharing, subscribing, telling your friends, all that kind of good stuff. You can help me out monetarily via Patreon or PayPal. But if you thought about doing that, please instead consider donating to one of the organizations listed in the description here, as whether you're listening to this as a podcast or YouTube video or whatever. One of the organizations listed in the description to help Palestinians or Lebanese in need, because, all of this stuff we're going to talk about is really, it's very much applicable to the current media landscape regarding coverage of Israel's apartheid and genocide in Palestine. So everything we're going to talk about is going to reflect a lot on that. And they do mention Israel a little bit because this has been long in the making. It's not a huge part of their book here. Later editions in various appendices and I think extra written prefaces take on that topic a little bit more. Not here. We're just going to stick with the original, but still, I'm going to make allusions to a lot of what has been going on and how media coverage has been essentially cultivating support for Israel's genocide. So yeah, let's jump into it with the preface. Now, in this book, they start out by laying out what they call the propaganda model, which is for them the lens through which they're going to analyze media and they're going to analyze the news. This is the propaganda model. But more than just the lens through which they're going to look at media, they say that the propaganda model is also the model that these media must comply to in order to be media at all. So they're like, what markers do news media have to satisfy? What criteria do they need to satisfy so that news stories can actually be told? And this propaganda model, in their words, is meant to satisfy and protect special interests that dominate the state and private activity. So on the one hand, there are real material reasons for the propaganda model to influence news media, and there are real people behind it. It's almost like a conspiracy in that case, even though they're incredibly clear. They're like, we are not conspiracy theorists. They insist on that. But it is kind of like that. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is because there's that fact on the one hand that there are real material individuals who actually benefit from this. And on the other hand, there are these more abstract systems and ideological beliefs like capitalism or American exceptionalism, everything like that, that is also being satisfied here, not necessarily with anyone at the helm or guiding it. Rather, these are ideological considerations. That is, there isn't really someone pulling the strings per se. It is part of a broader historical inertia that makes people think a certain way without giving them any opportunities to question it. But we'll get into all of that in the many examples we'll look at. So the media serve a very important function for the political class in the United States, in that the political class has historically had to confront this very annoying thing, and that is the public. Politicians tend to not really like people, and so they tend to want to, instead of listen to the people, to mold them, to shape them. Because believe it or not, and I don't know, I could be some hippie radical here, most people don't like war. And that's a problem for people who are profiting off of war. So they need a media industry that's going to justify the need for war, or justify the need for American aggression and regime change and violence throughout many different parts of the planet. But it's not just the media, and it's not just the political class. The media also rely very much upon the intellectual class, because a lot of what goes on in the media, especially when you look at these so-called reputable journals like the New York Times or the Washington Post, or I don't know, whoever considers themselves to be legitimate, the Atlantic, that's a good one. Any of these places, they try to sell themselves with this veneer of intellectuality or intellectualism, and they'll often lean upon, academics and quote unquote intellectuals to lend credence to the idea that the media and news that they are producing is intellectually rigorous and therefore is legitimate. And there's just something so pernicious about that, because it carefully narrows the possibilities of resistance or of opposition to those ideas. Because how are you going to fight rationality? You don't want to come off as being irrational. And this is my conspiracy theory, for those of you who have asked. No one's asked. My conspiracy theory is that news networks like Fox News, Newsweek, Newsmax, whatever, those very clearly almost clownish news networks, they emerged to make the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the LA Times, whatever, to seem legitimate and rational and therefore good and true. When all of what we're going to be talking about here is not about Fox News. Throughout the course of this book, they're talking about Fox News, what, we're often told is like a bastion for irrationality and xenophobic anger and violence and warmongering. No. Fox News is relatively new compared to the New York Times and CNN and stuff. We are going to be focusing, as Chomsky and Herman are focused on, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, because these have historically been the networks that have justified American aggression and imperialism and have whitewashed America's absolute atrocities when it comes to Vietnam, when it comes to Latin America, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China. Like, all of these places have been, like, American violence and continued violence is totally whitewashed. And not by Fox News people. No, these are the legitimate New York Times doing things like spreading atrocity propaganda and justifying American imperialism. Now, one of the ways news media is able to provide the veneer that it is this site of legitimate debate and discourse and the dissemination of legitimate news is that it will often do this thing called debates. It will bring people on from both sides of the political spectrum, as though we can reduce political views to one of two sides. Or in the case of like the New York Times, very notoriously on the cases of like trans people, are very willing to suddenly do away with this like two sides thing, and to have all these people show up and to give testimony about the horrors of a quote unquote trans ideology or something, and they'll never interview like a trans person because of course they're too biased. Whereas all these other people are neutral, objective, thinkers or academics that aren't biased in any way, shape, or form. And they do this by providing that veneer and illusion of actual deliberation, of debate, of argument, when it is actually just these very curated perspectives that are meant to feed into like broader assimilatory culture war type nonsense that it narrowly reduces the possibilities and options afforded to us as political agents in the world, and making it about like dunking on the other instead of coming up with actual like substantive community goals and organizations as to what people can do to improve their lives and to remedy some of the great problems we are collectively confronting. And we're seeing this play out today, of course, in like the digital age and the age of like Twitter and stuff, and the rise of like these online debate type things. It is all meant to carefully narrow the possibilities of political discourse while providing the illusion that it is actually opening up that political discourse. But of course, it is incredibly curated. It just picks the most bombastic figures from the internet-approved left/right on the political spectrum, and then gets them to yell at each other and get nowhere and just fan the flames of their bases that are then going to go online more and click more things and then generate more ad revenue for Twitter or Facebook or whatever. Because at the end of the day, that's who wins. You have these tech platforms or big media companies that love this type of like artificial debate and mudslinging that doesn't actually do anything in terms of improving people's lives, but is only good for the spectacle of this kind of democratic engagement. But then there are just all those topics that mainstream news will just never cover. Like, very mysteriously, how it just won't interview like Palestinians, for example, or how the New York Times, like the extent to which the New York Times covered October 7th, it far exceeds and eclipses any attention given to any of the massacres that Palestinians have endured for the past 75 years. And this is just a sign of the kind of bias that is just so present among the mass media. And it is a sign that media are not this neutral thing, rather they're satisfying certain national and ideological interests. Because if it was true that these mass media were in fact neutral and objective, they would be giving as much airtime to every single Palestinian death as they did to every single Israeli death on October 7th. But they don't do that. Because why? One of these people are seen as subhuman scum, and the other are these righteous victims to unbridled Arab terror, like is how it is framed essentially. Or if they do show any kind of affiliation with, like, take the New York Times, if they do, lend any kind of a sympathetic gaze towards the Palestinians, you'll find it at like the end of one of their articles, where they make sure that you go through their kind of like their filter through an article. They'll say things like, in response to Hamas's attack, these are numbers sponsored by the Hamas-run health ministry, stuff like this. Not just the New York Times, or the BBC and others. They make sure to put in all of these like ideological filters so that as you're reading it, it's preparing you, it's kind of poising you to understand and to immediately disregard any new information they might offer. And so I have one of my colleagues, shout out to Michael, who I work with, who always says that if you're going to read the New York Times, you have to read it backwards. Because if there's any new information, it's going to be at the end. Because that's where they're going to make sure to put the new information that might be consequential only after you've gone through their like propaganda filter. Hamas-run health ministry. October 7th, October 7th, October 7th, October 7th. Israeli victims, Israeli victims, Israeli victims. And then it's like, today Israel has murdered another 75 Palestinians for no good reason. And then you're like, what? Shouldn't that be the story? But these are the subtle and not so subtle ways that news media perpetuate ideological biases. Now, in the face of this, some people out there like to say, well, okay, the solution is that we need more facts. We need more facts. Facts. Am I pronouncing that right? Like a fact. F-A-C-T, not facts, like delivering mail type thing. We need more facts. And if we just had more facts, everything would just work out. But there's a problem with that. And the problem with that is that you've already chosen, though, a certain story to cover. So even if you pick a story and it has all the facts, everything is factually correct, we have to ask, like, why is this story being told? Why is this story gaining front page news coverage and not something else? And it's like, okay, well, we've dealt with the facts thing. Now we have to deal with the other ideological thing, in that we've made a choice to cover this story that we're going to present all the facts to or of, but we're not covering another story. Now, in like Judith Butler's terms, we would ask, whose lives are seen as grievable? Whose deaths earn media attention and whose deaths do not. So a single death in Ukraine, for example, is going to be met, like, it's going to get a lot more news coverage than the potentially 100,000 or more Palestinians that have been murdered by Israel with the U.S. sponsored state terror against the entire international community's democratic disapproval of Israel's actions. And it's interesting to see this difference in weight given to one side and one conflict over the other. And to just go back to the case of like reading the New York Times backwards because you have to go through their kind of propaganda filter, you see the same thing on like Twitter, where if you go onto Twitter and, like, for example, the people I follow on that godforsaken app, Twitter makes sure that when I open it, I need to like scroll through a sea of garbage about like, the righteousness of the Israeli military and all of this. You have to go through a sea of this stuff before you see the stuff you're actually like following that is actually like revealing the truths about these things, because we love truth around here, don't we? And it is just one of those other examples. And we can just adapt much of what I'm about to talk about when we move into the first chapter, adapt a lot of this to the digital age and how algorithmic biases influence what people know about the world. Because that's where a lot of people today are getting their news. Many, many, many people use social media platforms as their primary source for news. But these platforms are not neutral. They present some opportunities, some unique opportunities to get different perspectives out there without having to go through the gatekeeping filter of mainstream news, which is, it's a big enterprise and it's able to greatly limit what is presented there. There are opportunities through various social media platforms, be it Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, to actually present perspectives that would never go seen in the mainstream media. But it is hardly the solution, in that these social media platforms are susceptible to similar kinds of filters that we're about to discuss in ways that are actually really difficult to identify, because it is in accordance with various algorithmic filtering efforts that are difficult to trace and really understand how they operate. But in any case, let us move on to Chapter 1, a propaganda model. Now, media, they normalize the inequalities of our world. And obviously, this is much easier to recognize in contexts where the state owns media, where it's like, in the case of like Russia, whenever you read the New York Times talking about Russian news, it's like state-run Russian news, because then it's like, oh, well, the New York Times can point to Russia and be like, oh yeah, state-run news, to distract from the fact that the New York Times is a state-run paper, not in the sense that they mean, but in the sense that they are just reflecting and parroting American imperial interests on the world stage. And they do so with the veneer of being like these arbiters and this bastion of freedom of the press, of insurgency almost at times, of fighting power, and so on. When that is like, really? And it's much more difficult to see these kinds of biases play a role in media when they are ostensibly working within and operate within a private model, where it just seems like, oh, well, the most legitimate news is going to thrive because people vote with their dollar, and there isn't like someone pulling the strings. There aren't government forces determining what's being said. But does that mean it's still free of any kind of influence? And the answer is no. In fact, it is actually more influenced because no one can really tell, or it's much more difficult to tell, how it is being influenced. Like, which lobbyists are actually influencing it? Which ideological interests are actually playing a part in that editorial room? Where, it's actually a little bit easier, and I'm not advocating this, but like, if it's just state-run, then you know exactly who's influencing it. It makes it a lot easier to see through the nonsense and to actually get oppositional views at that point. When it's done in such a way as to obfuscate and to hide who's influencing it, it's a lot more difficult to actually oppose it. So for Chomsky and Herman, for the key of their propaganda filter, or the propaganda model, media are beholden to 5 filters, and they are as follows. The first filter is the profit motive, and I'm gonna expand on them. The first filter later. The first filter is the profit motive. The second filter is advertiser influence. The third filter is managed experts and government supplied information. And the fourth filter is flack for falling out of line. And finally, the fifth filter is anti-communism. Now, each of these filters has to be passed through and satisfied for a news story to actually make it to the front pages and pages of the New York Times or whatever. Where just in the case of the fifth one, anti-communism, you would never see a news report talking about communism in the way that it talks about capitalism during the Cold War. You'd never see that. You'd never see the same kind of attention given to victims of capitalist violence as you saw all of the news coverage and what is often parroted in all our history textbooks, the horrors of communism. You get reminded of that every single day. Everyone parrots this, the horrors of communism, of course. And very little attention is given to the similar horrors conducted through capitalist exploitation and violence. And you don't hear about that at all. And so this is just one of the 5 filters that a news story must pass through in order to actually be published at all. It has to demonstrate, especially 40, 50 years ago, it had to demonstrate a strong opposition to communism. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be taken seriously. It wouldn't even reach the airwaves at all. And while that is still very much true today, there's still a very strong anti-communist bias among these media. If you were to just do it on a national level instead and try to write news stories that spoke of, Iran in the way that they speak of Ukraine, you'd lose your job immediately. Your job's done. You could be saying all the facts. You could say every single fact there is about these things, but you'll still lose your job if you're working for the New York Times or you're trying to publish stories about somewhat sympathetic to Iran or Russia or China or something. Good luck. Good luck. Yeah, you can find examples of that one-off article buried on page 17 about maybe how American aggression is part of the problem here. And then you'll not see anything about it for another 18 weeks, and then something else will emerge, a kind of blip. The point is that there should be equal coverage that is done fairly on all topics if media are actually going to be neutral and objective. So now we're going to expand on the 5 filters, and we're going to go through them one by one with the first one. That is the profit motive, or the size, ownership, and profit orientation of mass media. So in the mid-19th century, the United States tried to curtail working class newspapers, because there were quite a few of them, working class, socialist, communist newspapers, and they opposed this by imposing heavy taxes and licensing costs on these newspapers, or just newspapers in general, which they knew that these smaller newspapers weren't actually going to be able to pay. But they could. In a lot of cases, they really could, because it had broad public support. Because believe it or not, workers were actually the majority, and they were very interested in unionizing, and they were interested in opposing capitalist capture of their surplus value in labor. Now, by the early 1870s, in the late 19th century, really, the US kind of changed their approach. Because they're like, well, if we just impose heavy taxes and licensing fees on these people, we're essentially giving them a benchmark that they need to just surpass, and then they're going to have a platform, which is doable. So the US got clever. The US got very clever in the late 19th century. They're like, instead, let's get rid of that. How about we just make it actually kind of easy to publish things? What if we instead just like kind of let the free market, quote unquote, filter the emergence of newspapers? And so what they allowed for is really the industrialization of the press, where now it wasn't that spreading news was for the sake of spreading news. Suddenly it became about profit, where news can actually become quite profitable. And when news is no longer about spreading news, but is just about being profitable, then it's going to start to get more scandalous. And as it gets more scandalous, more people are going to gravitate towards those more scandalous examples, because that's going to lead to more sales, lead to selling more stuff. So people will turn away from working class news or socialist news in favor of these scandalous, more, entertaining pieces of news rather than actually informative stuff. And then newspapers who aren't able to compete will just die out. And this is the triumph of the free market system, because on the one hand, it's trying to sell itself as this free market alternative to the rigidities of state power and taxation and all this. But it's really just another really effective form of control. And this is a side point here, but this is exactly what Michel Foucault writes about in terms of the shift from sovereign power to disciplinary power, where power doesn't work today because there's there's some sovereign or monolithic type Leviathan figure or whatever controlling society. It is instead that society will control itself through the free market, which is something he writes about quite a bit. And this encourages another kind of disciplining and another kind of exclusionary tactic that just, it no longer excludes people because of the mandates of some arbitrary authority like someone in power. It instead excludes people who aren't rich, who don't make money, who do not appeal to the market in these ways, which is something we've also subjected various other industries to, like housing, like healthcare, like food, which we somehow decided one day would be a good thing to reduce and to submit to the market, where, maybe I'm just a filthy communist, but I kind of don't think that healthcare should be something that's open to the market. I don't know, maybe that's bizarre of me, but it's one of the really effective ways to greatly limit what people can actually access under the veneer of it being free. Of course, it's the free market. How are you going to oppose that? But as these newspapers, or as newspapers in general, were open to the free market, they also then started to move towards monopolies. Sorry for my stumbling. Well, they started to move towards monopolies, and this is really bad today, where in the 1980s, Reagan got rid of some laws regulating the amount of news sources a company can own. So now you can have news sources and large media companies buying many other news sources and media companies, where today about 6 companies control 90% of news sources. 6 companies control 90% of news sources. And it's of course, they're going to greatly limit what these news sources can then write about. Are they going to allow these news sources to be writing expository, investigative pieces on these 6 large companies? Maybe every once in a while you can find some example of someone being somewhat critical, but it's hardly going to be given the kind of attention it deserves. And as news sources are becoming more and more beholden to the quote-unquote free market, they need to appeal to their investors. They need to appeal to their bottom line. They need to appeal to projections. They need to appeal to the board of trustees who are going to be asking presidents if they're going to be delivering on their financial promises. So of course these news outlets are going to be very interested in amplifying incendiary stuff that's going to lead to more Twitter battles or whatever, because that's how you get more engagement. That's how you get more clicks, which has now become synonymous with being globally knowledgeable about what's going on Earth and what the US is doing and has been doing. And that's exactly what Herman and Chomsky, they're calling for, is like, we want the most democratic system we can, but we can't have that if our news sources are beholden to all of these other forces. They need to be truly independent, and they need to be valued in themselves, not open to the market. Because then it's like, well, whose interests are they really going to serve? We don't know. And that puts us into the second filter, advertising. So the first filter, the profit motive, now advertising. There's some overlap here, but advertising. Now, advertising is necessary because they have to become, like, these newspapers have to become profitable, and advertisements are a great way to be profitable. Same with other, like, streaming platforms and stuff. They rely so much upon advertisements. And it really reveals the extent to which that when you're watching content or you're taking in news or whatever, it's starting to feel more and more like you're just there for the advertisements. Like, this content has been put there for the advertisements because that's how they're making their money. Like, that's the point, really. That's why you're there, is to be eyeballs for the advertisements. But advertisers play a very strong role in the success or failure of these newspapers and media outlets, where, you know, they don't want to upset these advertisers by posting anything or by publishing anything that is going to make those advertisers look bad or is going to, you know, disrupt the advertisers' interests. And so these media platforms are then beholden to these advertisers' interests. So will advertisers love if there's a bunch of pro-union articles being published? Probably not, because a lot of these advertisers are probably large corporations. And these large corporations probably don't love the idea of their workers unionizing. But we are just going after what is democratically approved. If we were to poll how many people would prefer to be in a union than not, I think that our news should reflect what that poll tells us, where maybe we should have more and more news not bashing unions or not working towards union busting, but more and more news sources and more articles being published that is sympathetic towards unions, but you don't see that. You see the exact opposite. That puts us into the third filter, the sourcing of mass media news. Now, really simply, news sources can't have people everywhere all the time. Now this has changed. Of course, this book is quite a few decades old. This has changed with, the telephones or cell phones everywhere, and people can actually show a video from across the world and be like, this is what's going on right now. Everyone can see. 40 years ago or so, 50 years ago, there needed to actually be news people sent to places, which they still do today, but actually sent there with their cameras to get footage and proof of what's going on, which they didn't do all the time because that's expensive, isn't always reliable, it can be dangerous. So instead, they've often had to historically just rely upon government reports, especially in cases of American imperialism where they have troops deployed in some poor Vietnamese or Cambodian peasant villages, and they are telling the story that will eventually be relayed to the American people, where there are no news people there to corroborate or confirm. And when those stories are told, nobody questions it. It's just taken as fact. The same thing today with Israel, where it's anything the Israeli military says, most of the time, these large media sources are just going to be yeah, and it was totally true. But if you were to get some kind of a testimony out of an official from Hamas, then it has to be absolutely discredited. It has to be questioned ad nauseum. The same with Russia or Iran or something. Whereas if it comes from an American-inspired source, nobody questions it. It's just, oh yeah, that must be true. So they do the same thing when they appeal to experts or draw upon experts in certain fields. And these experts are going to be carefully curated and selected to reflect their interests. So they aren't going to pick a super pro-union expert to actually talk about unions to show up on CNN or the New York Times. They're going to get somebody who's just going to quote unquote talk about the facts or what is going on just at the level of brute who, what, where, when, why. No actual substantive analysis or historical analysis that can contextualize something. Similarly with the case of October 7th, which the New York Times and other media outlets just love to treat as the origin of the quote-unquote Israel-Palestine conflict. There's very little consideration given to the entire history here. There's very little effort to actually contextualize this. Instead, it is simply about framing the narrative in such a way as to appeal to these American interests. And don't get me wrong, it's not just America. I mean, that's what their book is focused on. The entire West is absolutely, they are what's the word? Should be held accountable. There's another word, but words are hard. They should be implicated in this as well. Canada's no better. Same stuff. I mean, the CBC, more of a state-run type news source. It's independent, but it does get state Canadian funds. Of course, it has so many biases. One of the things that the CBC, I mean, I don't know, am I going to get sued for this? Is that how this works? But one of the things the CBC does, in my opinion, is that on the cases of where we really see this play out is in the way that they depict homeowners or landowners versus tenants, where it's always like they love to do stories about these poor landlords who, like, a tenant will refuse to move out. And then they'll do a whole story about this landlord. But you see relatively little news about any tenants who are being wrongfully evicted or renovicted or anything like that. How come this tiny minority of people, that is landlords compared to tenants, are given such disproportionate sympathy and treatment in the mass media versus tenants, who comprise the majority and who are historically and pretty much by definition in a worse economic position because they do not have the means to own property? So the news will source certain people to reflect certain interests, be they experts or government officials or whatever. And this also comes down to like boots on the ground type, like in a conflict zone or something, they're going to be very careful about who they select to represent a people, to represent, for example, like Gazans or Palestinians. It's very interesting to see which Palestinians and which perspectives coming from Palestinians mainstream news is willing to amplify versus all those people screaming at the top of their lungs about the horrors of Israeli occupation, and how those people that comprise the vast majority of Palestinians aren't, do I sound like a Canadian? Aren't the ones being amplified. And that puts us into the fourth filter, flack and the enforcers. Now, flack might just look like letters, telegrams, phone calls, petitions, lawsuits, speeches, and bills before Congress, and other modes of complaint, threat, and punitive action. And this comes largely from the public. And one of the things that this is has often been the case about is in the case of Israel, once again. They don't write about this here. I'm just using this example because they're just talking quite generally about these filters, and I'm going to give my examples. Where in the case of Israel, if a news source publishes anything that is remotely critical of Israel, even if it's a lefty Zionist critical approach, they're going to get flooded and have historically gotten flooded with emails and phone calls from people being very mad, threatening to pull their subscription services, and this isn't even what is a properly anti-Zionist approach. Of course, you won't see any of that in mainstream news. You will just see, if anything, the kind of liberal Haaretz-like aligned approach, which is still a pro-Israeli, pro-American perspective that still uses terms like Hamas-run health ministry to sow doubt about the validity of the numbers of people that Israel has brutally murdered. But this is something that Edward Said writes about a fair amount, where he talks about how, I don't know if it might have been under Jimmy Carter, and even George Bush. I think it might have been George Bush Sr. But there have been a few presidents. No one's been as bad as Joe Biden among the presidents on approving Israeli violence. Where even George Bush kind of gave a call to and even Reagan too, called up the Israeli government and was like, "You need to stop. You just straight up need to stop." And it did follow through with some pause, something that Joe Biden would never dare do because, of course, he's absolutely beholden to those forces. But then these people, this is what Said writes about, the White House got flooded with calls, with letters, essentially expressing like death threats a lot of the time, and like the really making it clear that, in Said's words, that Israel is not a foreign issue, it's a domestic one. Like, it's something that within U.S. political and social life is a domestic issue, and it's going to be met with a lot of resistance if somebody does not take the right approach towards it. I mean, I could just share my DMs with some of you. It's pretty haunting stuff, like the kind of anger that is inspired or that emerges if anyone is critical of Israel, in even the most gentle ways, which I'd certainly try not to be gentle on Israel at all. Now, beyond public inspired letters and stuff, there's also AIM, or Accuracy in Media, which is pretty much a right-wing organization that has been responsible for manipulating. Am I allowed to say that? I don't know. I'm at this point now where I'm like, yeah, you gotta be a little careful what you say, David. Accuracy in Media is an organization that has, as Herman and Chomsky show, they have pressured news networks to orient their quote-unquote objectivity towards right-wing facts, quote-unquote. So they and other organizations like Freedom House, for example, they introduced the need for this thing called balanced journalism, which has just meant include a right-winger on things, include someone who's going to represent the Republican Party. And this provides, again, that illusion of a wide range of perspectives, a wide range of views, when that's not the case at all. And you see this too among those like internet lefty-based type pseudo-radical intellectual types that are like love to platform, the Jordan Petersons of the world and stuff. And even if they're doing so because they want to show the world how like incorrect they are, they never do it with any teeth. Of course, it just comes down to them platforming these people. And I'm like, why aren't you platforming like Angela Davis if she's taking? I mean, she's done her dues, but like anybody else who's now working with like any given like a grassroots organization and actually trying to push for proper change in the world and has their boots on the ground and making these changes. And it's because those people aren't renowned in the same ways as these right-wing ding-dongs, and they aren't going to elicit and encourage the same number of clicks and engagement that is going to generate more profit revenue, more ad revenue on YouTube or whatever. And we're going to get into this in a lot more detail in the next episode, but Freedom House and Accuracy in Media, one of the big things that they responded to was the way the media spoke out against the death squads in El Salvador, because these death squads were largely inspired by and funded by the U.S. military. And when media actually got a hold of these stories, they covered it a little bit. We're going to get into a lot more detail, but they actually covered it a little bit. And these organizations like Freedom House and Accuracy in Media were like, oh no, we can't have that. I mean, you have to be balanced in your journalism. You need someone who's going to be for the death squads to come on here and explain the important need of the death squads and why it's really important that there's a U.S.-inspired coup in Guatemala, or trying to do a coup in Nicaragua or anywhere else. And this would come to stand in for what quote-unquote balanced or objective journalism should look like. And now finally, the fifth filter, anti-communism. So newspapers adopted a staunch anti-communist stance, obviously. And this was largely in response to Soviet, Chinese, Cuban, Vietnamese revolutions and the apparent threat of communism. But it was hardly reserved for these other governments and these other economic systems, where it was pretty much anybody who was just marginally left of center could be branded as a communist. You still see this today. It still goes on. It's taken on a new form a lot of the time. It's like anybody who cares about like racism is just this woke, academically based intellectual type or something, and there isn't actually any substance to these kinds of claims or anything like that. How it's the denigration of Western civilization with this consideration of wokeism or identity or anything like that. just basic stuff to drum up some artificial anger to distract from what people should really be angry about. And so news media played a very important role, and has played a very important role in overthrowing or justifying the overthrow of communist governments all around the world, like in Vietnam. The myth that the United States was liberating Vietnam from the northern communists. Total myth. We'll get into that, but total myth. Or how the media was indispensable to justify the U.S.'s overthrow of the Bosch government in the Dominican Republic, where they're a communist government. And they will then scour the land for an anti-communist Dominican, for example, to speak on behalf of everybody. And this is something the news media did with Cuba as well, and would do with Vietnam, is they would scour the land for someone of that region who is opposed to communism, and then they're going to amplify their voice and be like, oh, this person said this, so therefore this stands in for everybody, every single Cuban. When those people are just, of course you can find examples of that. There's a term for that in Cuba as a gusano, a worm, somebody who capitulates to American interest and demand, or like this is the whole Scarface thing. Is Scarface a cautionary tale about American materialism and the American dream? Maybe someone could read it as that. It's hard not to think that the film has actually had the opposite effect in terms of really amplifying the beauty of the American dream for grinding 5 a.m. ice bath dudes. But in any case, we see how there's this anti-communist effort at play from news media to popular entertainment to television and so on. Now, these 5 filters, they greatly limit what can be said and shared among mainstream media. And they will also shape who is considered to be a worthy victim from an unworthy victim, whose death earns great media attention and whose death does not, or whose deaths. So for example, in 1983, the Soviet Union shot down a Korean passenger plane. Horrible. Absolutely horrible, and the mainstream media covered it extensively, as they should. I mean, absolutely horrible. But by contrast, there was barely a peep about Israel shooting down a Libyan plane 10 years earlier, in 1973. And on this, the New York Times, this is what the New York Times wrote. This was Israel shooting down a passenger plane. This is what the New York Times said. No useful purpose is served by an acrimonious debate over the assignment of blame, which is something we often hear coming out of the State Department in the U.S. or mainstream news in the U.S. about Israel today is like, oh, we need to wait for all the facts to come out. We need to wait for Israel to do its investigation. There's no point pointing fingers now. But if they can point the finger at Russia, they'll do so immediately at any moment they can. Or China, they don't need to wait for the facts to come out. They'll just say what happened and the blame that they're prepared to attribute to these foreign nations. So massacres, suffering, death, these won't be taken seriously unless they satisfy elite interest. So various different, for example, the death squads in Guatemala or Chile, U.S.-inspired death squads, aren't given any attention, or they're given very little attention. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll get into it. But yeah, we'll wrap that up here. Next episode, we're going to get into Latin America and the case of Eastern Europe with the chapter called Worthy and Unworthy Victims. But yeah, if you made it this far, tune in next time where we'll continue this. And tell me what you think. If there's anything I left out, something I got wrong, I'd love to hear about it. There are so many different ways to think through this. Leave comments how you've seen this unfold and the propaganda model at play today, because it needs a lot of analysis. And we can't let, the Trumpists of the world lay claim to this fake news thing. Because we've been saying this for decades, on this fabled thing called the left. We've always talked about how the mainstream media are biased. And now suddenly the right has laid claim to that criticism. What? No, this is our thing. But yeah, so let me know. Share with the world. And on that note, I hope you're all well. Catch you next time.